The first time German officers heard the word Firefly, they didn't flinch. It sounded harmless, almost quaint, a nickname for yet another Sherman, the tank they dismissed as soft-skinned, undergunned, and fatally common. But in the summer of 1944, in the dark hedgerows of Normandy, a British conversion of that ordinary machine began writing a new rule. The hunter could kill the king with a single shot. It started with a problem. The standard 75 millimeter Shermans that rolled off landing craft after D-Day could not reliably penetrate the armor of a Tiger One from the front. Crews learned this hard truth under the bocage canopy, where ranges collapsed and ambushes ruled. British ordnance officers, led by innovators like Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge and Major George Brighty, pushed an audacious answer into reality. Shoehorn the Royal Ordnance 17-pounder, a long, high-velocity anti-tank gun, into a Sherman turret never designed to hold it. It took ingenuity bordering on stubbornness. The gun's massive breech had to be rotated sideways, the recoil gear rearranged. The radio moved into a welded bustle at the turret rear. The loader's world shrank to inches. But when the first test firing shattered the backstop and the muzzle blast rolled like thunder, the skeptics went quiet. The Firefly was born. Normandy would become its proof. In June and July 1944, British and Commonwealth armored regiments began blending Fireflies into their Sherman troops, one long-barreled silhouette among three short. Crews camouflaged the extended gun with distemper stripes to deceive rangefinders. They draped foliage along the barrel to break its outline. The Firefly's best ammunition, APCBC for consistent penetration, and later APDS for breathtaking velocity at the cost of accuracy, turned the equation. From 800 to 1,200 meters, a well-placed shot could crack the Tiger's front, and from the flank it was decisive. German officers at the front learned about it the way soldiers always do. Reports first, rumors second, wrecks last. A Tiger angled hull down on a French rise one afternoon. Confidence, thick as the smell of hot oil, erupted at the turret ring. The armor peeled outward like a burst seam. The surviving crew swore it was artillery. Recon found no battery, only the telltale furrow of a single long recoil stroke in a hedgerow firing position and brass cases stamped 17-pounder. Another Tiger, reversing through orchards near Saint-Aignan, was drilled through the mantlet. The rounds spoled the fighting compartment in a storm of steel. A staff captain peered into the blackened hull and said what everyone was thinking but did not want to believe. A Sherman did this. The disbelief had roots. The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine around qualitative edge. Thick armor, hard-hitting guns, elite crews. Shermans, they thought, were arithmetic. But arithmetic, weaponized, becomes strategy. Allied production already outnumbered German armored strength. Now one in every troop could also kill their heaviest tank head-on under the right conditions. Reports from panzer battalions began to add a new caution. Beware the Sherman with the long barrel. In mess tents and map rooms, British troop leaders refined the Firefly's role. Let the short-barreled Shermans fix the enemy. Keep the Firefly massed until a flank or a weak angle appeared. Fire once, move fast, fire again. In Normandy's close country, that doctrine turned ambush into art. And somewhere in those hedgerows, a German officer lifted binoculars toward a deceptively familiar American silhouette, a flicker of sun along an unusually long tube, and felt the ground shift beneath the old certainties. The Tiger crew had seen hundreds of Shermans before. Most ended the same way. The first round from their 88 millimeter gun tearing through the thinner American armor before the enemy even found their range. The Firefly looked no different that morning outside Villers-Bocage. Same sloped hull, same silhouette, same supposed inferiority. But as the Tiger's commander swung his binoculars toward the tree line, he saw the muzzle flash. A split second later, the entire front of his tank erupted in sparks and smoke. The 17-pounder's shell had struck just below the mantlet, slicing through armor that had once been considered invincible. The Tiger shuddered, black smoke billowed through its vents, and the crew scrambled to escape. For the first time in months, a Sherman had won the duel, not by luck, but by design. News of that single shot spread fast through German ranks. Intelligence officers first dismissed it as an exaggeration, another Allied propaganda trick, but the wreckage told its own story. The entry hole was narrow, precise, too clean for artillery, too small for air attack. Engineers measuring the impact angle realized that only a high-velocity gun could have caused such penetration. The Tiger's front armor, nearly 100 millimeters thick, had been defeated from over 800 meters away. At German Armored Command headquarters, the mood shifted from disbelief to curiosity. Orders went out to capture one of these long-barreled Shermans intact. Crews were told to prioritize disabling over destroying. Field reports started coming in from the 12th SS Panzer Division in Panzerlehr. Enemy fielding Sherman with unusually long gun, likely 76.2 millimeters or equivalent. Armor penetration exceptional. For the Germans, it was an uncomfortable revelation. They had assumed their superiority was permanent, their tanks heavier, their armor thicker, their guns unmatched. Now, in the span of a few weeks, they were being forced to respect the same vehicle they had once ridiculed. Meanwhile, in the Allied ranks, the Firefly crews were learning to fight with cunning. The tank was powerful, yes, but also a priority target. German spotters quickly learned to look for the long 17-pounder barrel and target it first. British crews painted the gun's tip in camouflage, some even adding fake muzzle brakes to mimic standard Shermans. They learned to fire once and move, never lingering long enough for the enemy to return fire. In Normandy's claustrophobic bocage, where every hedgerow could hide a gun, the Firefly's reach was its greatest weapon. Its high-velocity rounds could destroy a Tiger or Panther before either could close the distance. The gun's massive recoil rocked the turret with every shot, echoing through the fields like thunder. German infantry began to dread that sound, a deep, sharp crack followed by a long silence, then the dull roar of exploding armor. Captured German documents later revealed how much the Firefly had unnerved their tank commanders. Some believed the Allies had developed a completely new tank. Others thought the British had secretly armed their Shermans with captured 88mm guns. The psychological effect was as potent as the weapon itself. By late July, German units along the Caen front were beginning to change tactics. Tank crews started avoiding open ground where the Firefly's range gave it an advantage. Orders instructed them to close the distance as quickly as possible, to use terrain, fog, and darkness to negate the 17-pounder's power. But Normandy offered little mercy. The Firefly could see them long before they could see it. What began as a field improvisation was turning into a battlefield equalizer. For the first time since 1942, the Allies possessed a tank gun that could not only match but surpass the Wehrmacht's finest armor. And in the heart of that revelation, deep within the cold steel of an adapted Sherman turret, was proof that innovation, not arrogance, would decide who ruled the battlefield. As German officers studied the wreckage of another Tiger, the conclusion was becoming impossible to deny. The weapon that destroyed it hadn't come from a new supertank or a secret Allied prototype. It had come from the same unassuming machine they had once mocked, and it had done the impossible. It had killed a Tiger with a single, perfect shot. By mid-July 1944, the German command no longer dismissed the reports. Too many Tigers had been lost under mysterious circumstances. No artillery barrage, no rocket strike, no air attack, just a single distant shot and instant destruction. The culprit was always the same, a Sherman with an unnaturally long barrel. The soldiers on the ground began calling it the Snake. The battlefield evidence was undeniable. Tanks struck from over a kilometer away, armor perforated at angles that should have been safe. German engineers inspected the wrecks and measured the holes, narrow, smooth-edged punctures where no Allied weapon had been thought capable of reaching. The numbers didn't lie. The penetration matched that of their own 88mm. And yet this new threat came from a tank they'd once considered laughable. At the Panzer headquarters near Falaise, officers gathered around a map dotted with red pins. Each one marked a Tiger or Panther lost to an Allied gun they couldn't yet name. Some refused to believe it. Others demanded proof. And when that proof came, a captured Firefly examined in detail, the mood turned grim. The British had done what German designers had said was impossible, fitted a high-velocity anti-tank gun into a medium chassis. The 17-pounder was powerful enough to pierce 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. It was crude in some ways, the turret cramped, the recoil savage, but the results were catastrophic for any German crew in its sights. To the German officers studying the wreckage, it was humiliating. For years, they had believed that quality outweighed quantity, that superior craftsmanship and thicker armor would always triumph. Now, in Normandy's muddy fields, that confidence was dying one Tiger at a time. The Allies had taken the tank they mocked most and turned it into a predator. On the battlefield, the change was visible. Fireflies hid in the hedgerows, barrels draped with branches, their long guns breaking through camouflage like spears. They waited in silence as German armor advanced, their gunners trained to hold fire until the perfect shot. When the 17-pounder roared, its muzzle flash briefly lit the green walls of the bocage like lightning. A split second later, hundreds of meters away, a Tiger's turret would erupt in a blast of molten steel. To the British crews, every kill was survival. They knew that if a Tiger saw them first, one shell from its 88 would obliterate them. But for the first time, they no longer had to fear the distance. They could strike first, and that changed everything. German tank commanders began to alter their movements. Patrols advanced with infantry screens, scanning every ridge, every orchard. The long, thin shadow of the Firefly haunted them. Reports flooded in. Enemy Sherman with extended barrel capable of defeating Tiger armor. Extreme caution advised some crews refused to engage if one was spotted. It was no longer arrogance. It was survival instinct. Behind the lines, German engineers tested captured 17-pounder shells. Their velocity and penetrative power were staggering. Even the front plate of a Tiger, once a symbol of invulnerability, was no match for a direct hit. The weapon's efficiency in British hands stunned them further. It was not advanced metallurgy or secret chemistry. It was clever engineering, using what was available. The irony was bitter. The Germans had once built tanks to intimidate. Now a modified Allied workhorse was doing the same to them. Every Panther that burned in a French field, every Tiger left smoldering on the road to Caen, was another reminder that their technological superiority no longer guaranteed victory. By the end of the month, the term Firefly had entered German field reports. It was no longer a rumor, it was a reality. Officers briefed their crews to identify it immediately and destroy it before it could fire. But that advice was easier given than followed. In Normandy's twisting lanes and broken countryside, the Firefly's first shot was usually its last, because it never needed a second. For the first time in the war, the hunters had become the hunted. The fields of Normandy had turned into killing grounds of steel and smoke. By late July 1944, the German armored divisions that once rolled across Europe with unstoppable momentum now found themselves hunted by an enemy that had quietly learned, adapted, and evolved. The Firefly, with its long, slender gun and thunderous recoil, had transformed the battlefield into a new kind of duel. One no longer dictated by brute strength, but by cunning and reach. The Firefly was not elegant. It was awkward to drive, heavy at the turret, and cramped inside. Its 17-pounder gun left barely enough room for the loader to maneuver, and the recoil threatened to break bones if someone stood too close. Yet for all its imperfections, it was devastatingly effective. Crews joked that they were sitting on a powder keg, but they did so with the quiet confidence that they finally had something that could kill a Tiger. Near Saint-Aignan, the British 11th Armored Division demonstrated that power. German reinforcements, including Tigers from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, had been spotted advancing through a narrow valley. The British tankers positioned themselves along the ridgelines. Fireflies mixed among standard Shermans. As the German column rolled into view, the Tiger commanders assumed it was another routine engagement. They opened fire first, shells slamming into the hedgerows and scattering soil into the air. The Firefly gunners waited, calm and patient. Then came the order. One shot. The first 17-pounder round streaked across the valley like a spear of white light. It struck a Tiger square in the front plate. The explosion blew open the turret and hurled it backward, black smoke pouring skyward. Within minutes, 2 more Tigers were burning. The rest of the column halted, confused and panicked. searching for the source of destruction they could not yet see. When the firing stopped, the valley was silent except for the crackle of fire and the hiss of cooling steel. For the British crews, the victory was tactical. For the Germans, it was existential. Word spread quickly. The Sherman with the long barrel could destroy a Tiger from over a kilometer away. Even the thickest armor was no longer protection. At command headquarters, German officers studied reconnaissance photos of the battlefield. Burned-out Tigers lay nose down in the earth, blackened from the inside out. They traced the likely firing positions on the map and realized, with horror, how far the enemy had been. The Firefly could kill them before their own guns reached range. In the field, German crews began changing their doctrine. They no longer lingered on open ground, no longer trusted their frontal armor. They learned to move unpredictably, to never expose their silhouette for long. The balance of power had shifted, not entirely, but enough to shake the foundation of their confidence. Even so, the Firefly's success was not about numbers. Only about 2,000 were ever built, a fraction of the total Sherman force, but their psychological impact far outweighed their presence. To Allied crews, they were guardians, the long-barreled angels that could stand toe-to-toe with German armor. To the enemy, they were phantoms that struck unseen, turning once invincible tanks into smoldering ruins. Every time a Firefly crew loaded a shell, they knew they were holding the answer to years of suffering at the hands of the Tiger and the Panther. Every time the gun thundered, it was more than a shot fired. It was a declaration that the age of German invincibility was ending. The Firefly was not born from luxury or excess. It was born from desperation, from field improvisation, from engineers and soldiers who refused to accept that superiority was permanent. And now, across the broken farmlands of France, that refusal was burning its message into history, written in steel, smoke, and shattered armor. The Firefly had done what few thought possible. It had forced the Tiger to retreat. By August 1944, the myth of German invulnerability was collapsing as surely as the walls of Normandy's bocage. The Sherman Firefly had rewritten the equation of armored warfare. Where once a Tiger's advance had sent Allied crews scrambling for cover, now it was the German tankers who hesitated, scanning every ridgeline for that one unmistakable silhouette. A Sherman with a barrel far too long to ignore. The transformation had been gradual, but its effects were absolute. The Wehrmacht's heavy tank divisions, built on intimidation and shock, were suddenly fighting a war of fear. Reports from panzer units began to reveal a new kind of caution. Enemy tank, long 17-pounder gun, extreme range. Recommend withdrawal until infantry support available. In a matter of weeks, the Firefly had become a weapon not only of destruction, but of psychological warfare. In a small French village east of Caen, one such confrontation sealed the Firefly's reputation. The German 21st Panzer Division had been regrouping for a counterattack, its Tigers positioned along a narrow stone road leading into town. They were confident, disciplined, and still believed that no Allied gun could threaten them head-on. Hidden 2 kilometers away, a British Sherman troop waited in ambush. The Firefly crew adjusted their sights carefully, the gunner's hand trembling not from fear, but from anticipation. The Tiger appeared between the smoke and dust. The Firefly's gun roared. The 17-pounder shell flew straight and true, striking just below the turret ring. The explosion lifted the Tiger's turret clean off its hull and sent it crashing to the ground beside the road. The German crews froze in disbelief. A single Sherman, one shot, had annihilated their strongest machine. When word of that engagement reached German command, disbelief turned into reluctant respect. The intelligence assessments began to use a new term. Sherman Firefly, high-velocity variant, extreme threat. The old arrogance that had defined German engineering had given way to a grim realization. They had been outthought, not outbuilt. The irony was almost cruel. German officers had long mocked Allied reliance on the Sherman, calling it a grave on tracks, a mass-produced toy compared to their precision machines. But the Firefly was something different. It was the perfect combination of industrial pragmatism and battlefield necessity. A weapon built not to impress, but to survive. In the workshops and depots behind the front, captured Fireflies were dissected by German engineers. They noted the rough welding, the repurposed fittings, the awkward placement of the radio in the turret bustle, and yet nothing about it could be dismissed. It was brutal, effective, and most of all, reliable. This is not elegance, one report concluded. This is war. Meanwhile, in the Allied camps, Firefly crews were earning reputations as quiet legends. They knew the risks. The long barrel made their tanks priority targets, yet they embraced it. Every engagement carried the same unspoken tension. One shot could decide who lived and who died. Some crews painted symbols on their guns, not for vanity, but as silent tallies of survival. In one documented case, a single Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry destroyed 3 Tigers in less than 12 minutes. The feat would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Now it was the measure of how much the battlefield had changed. The German officers at the front could no longer deny the truth. The age of armored dominance, built on their heavy steel beasts, was fading. The Firefly, a machine born from improvisation and desperation, had pierced not only their tanks, but their confidence. In the coming weeks, as the German forces began to fall back toward the Seine, one bitter observation circulated among panzer crews. "We no longer fight the Sherman, we fight the Firefly." The laughter that once echoed through German command when they heard the name Sherman had gone silent. Now it was replaced by something else. The cold understanding that even the mightiest armor could be undone by ingenuity, patience, and one perfect shot. As August turned to September 1944, the German army was retreating through France in disarray. What had once been a meticulously engineered war machine was now struggling to hold its shape under the relentless pressure of Allied firepower and the speed of their advance. Among the many factors that broke the myth of German invincibility, none struck at the heart of their pride quite like the Sherman Firefly. The tank that German officers had mocked for years had now proven capable of destroying their most treasured creation, the Tiger one. The reality was humiliating. For months, German engineers had obsessed over perfection, complex transmissions, intricate suspension systems, and precise tolerances that required hand-fitted parts. The Firefly, by contrast, was crude. Its modifications had been made in field workshops and depots, sometimes with parts scavenged from wrecks. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. By early September, captured Fireflies were being examined at German proving grounds. The engineers who studied them were divided between professional fascination and quiet despair. They dismantled the 17-pounder, weighed its components, and analyzed its penetration tables. The data confirmed what their frontline troops had been saying for weeks. It was the first Allied weapon that could defeat their heavy tanks consistently, even from range. Some officers argued it was luck, that the Firefly was a rare exception. But others saw something deeper, a change in philosophy. The Allies had adapted, and they had done so faster than anyone expected. The Germans had believed that innovation was their domain alone, but now the enemy was turning practicality into genius. Meanwhile, in the field, British and Canadian Firefly crews pressed their advantage. In the drive toward the Falaise pocket, Fireflies were placed deliberately at the rear of advancing formations, using their superior range to cover their comrades. Every German vehicle caught moving in the open became a target. Their shells cracked through the air like whips, the impact thunder echoing across the fields. The British reports from those days were almost clinical in tone. Engage Tiger at 1,200 meters, 1 round. Complete destruction. For the Germans, such lines were devastating to read. The Tiger, the embodiment of power, the tank that once ruled the battlefield, was now falling to a weapon mounted on a machine they had derided as obsolete. There was no longer any comfort in numbers or armor thickness. The Firefly's gun turned those advantages into liabilities, making every German tank a potential coffin. Morale began to erode. Tank crews that once rolled into battle with arrogance now moved with hesitation. They began to fear open ground, avoided daylight maneuvers, and relied on defensive positions instead of attack. The balance of initiative, once firmly in German hands, had shifted. Even among German engineers, a bitter irony took root. The Tiger had been designed to be the unstoppable predator of its age. It was massive, over-engineered, and capable of annihilating anything in front of it. But it was slow, difficult to repair, and hopelessly unsuited for the grinding war that the Allies were now waging. The Firefly, meanwhile, represented everything the Germans had dismissed: adaptability, mass production, and simplicity. As the Wehrmacht retreated across northern France, the Firefly became a symbol of inevitability. Every burned-out Tiger along the roadside told the same story. The Hunter had been outmaneuvered by a machine it never respected. And the German officers, who once laughed at the idea of a Sherman killing a Tiger, now avoided mentioning its name altogether. By the time the Allies crossed the Seine, the lesson was clear. Perfection had failed, practicality had prevailed, and the Firefly, a tank that was never meant to exist, had become one of the most feared machines on the Western Front. In the ruins of their command posts, the German officers, studying maps of retreat, began to understand what that meant. The Tiger might still be formidable, but its legend had been pierced, not just by a shell, but by the realization that the war had changed. By the time September 1944 bled into October, the German High Command could no longer conceal the uncomfortable truth. Their prized Tigers and Panthers were no longer untouchable. What they had once treated as unstoppable juggernauts were now increasingly destroyed, abandoned, or immobilized in the mud of retreat. And more often than not, the wrecks bore the same kind of wound: a single, surgically precise hole from a Sherman Firefly's 17-pounder. The reports from the front had turned grimly repetitive. Entire panzer platoons lost to ambushes at ranges once thought impossible. Panthers caught on open roads, burned out from a hit that pierced both armor and pride. The Allies had not only matched German firepower, they had outsmarted it. In the forests of Belgium, near the border with Germany, one such encounter became legendary among both sides. A column of Panthers, returning from a failed counterattack, was making its way through a fog-shrouded valley. The crews were weary, their tanks streaked with mud, their fuel nearly gone. They believed the area secure. But hidden on the opposite ridge, camouflaged among the trees, 3 Fireflies lay in wait. The British gunners held their fire until the lead Panther entered a clearing. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap, and the 17-pounder round tore through the German tank's frontal plate, igniting the ammunition inside. The second Firefly fired almost simultaneously, hitting the trailing vehicle. Within moments, the column was trapped, burning steel at both ends of the road. The surviving German crews scrambled for cover, their once dominant machines helpless against the unseen enemy above. Afterward, when the smoke cleared, the Firefly crews simply relocated. They didn't linger, didn't celebrate. They knew the German artillery would soon retaliate. Their role was surgical: strike hard, strike fast, and vanish. The Firefly's long barrel was as much a liability as it was a weapon. Its flash could give away its position instantly. Success depended on precision and timing. To the Germans who investigated the wreckage, the psychological impact was immense. The holes left by the 17-pounder shells were terrifying in their simplicity: neat, smooth, and small compared to the devastation inside. The sheer power of the gun defied what they believed possible from a Sherman. A few months earlier, they would have called it propaganda. Now it was just the new reality. Back in the factories and command centers of Germany, engineers debated frantic solutions. Some proposed thicker armor. Others wanted to develop countermeasures or upgrade the optics for faster target acquisition. But none of it mattered. They were running out of materials, out of fuel, out of time, and the Allies were producing Fireflies faster than Germany could replace its losses. The irony was inescapable. German design had reached its pinnacle. The Tiger II, a marvel of engineering, capable of destroying anything it faced. Yet in the mud and cold of real battle, such perfection was a curse. It broke down, it ran dry, it bogged in terrain the Sherman could cross easily. The Firefly didn't need to be the best, it only needed to work, and to fire first. For the German officers, who had once laughed at the idea of a Sherman standing against their heavy armor, the laughter was gone. What replaced it was an uneasy respect. They recognized the Firefly as a weapon born of necessity, shaped by war's harshest truths. It was ugly, cramped, and temperamental, but it was also lethal, and more importantly, available. By autumn, Allied tankers spoke of the Firefly with quiet pride. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave them what they had lacked for so long, a fighting chance. The gunner's seat, cramped and deafening, had become a place of reckoning, a spot where a single pull of the trigger could change the course of a battle. In the east, the Soviets were advancing. In the west, the Fireflies were cutting through German armor like a scythe through brittle steel. For the Wehrmacht's once proud panzer forces, there was no denying it anymore. The age of domination was over. And as the wrecks of tigers and panthers smoldered along the roads of retreat, one phrase began to circulate among the survivors, whispered with a mix of disbelief and respect: the Sherman that kills. By October 1944, the Western Front had become a graveyard of burnt-out armor. Along every hedgerow and field road from Normandy to Aachen, the blackened shells of tigers and panthers lay scattered like monuments to arrogance. And in the growing legend of their destruction, one name echoed through the ranks of both armies: Firefly. German tank crews spoke the word with a kind of grim superstition. They no longer saw the Sherman as a weakling to be mocked. The Firefly had changed that forever. Its long, menacing barrel had become a symbol of death. For many, the first sight of that gun protruding from a tree line was also the last thing they ever saw. The truth was simple and devastating. The Allies had turned a mass-produced tank, once derided for its mediocrity, into a weapon capable of challenging the best armored force in the world. The Firefly's 17-pounder gun was now a legend in its own right, powerful, temperamental, and terrifyingly accurate in the hands of a skilled crew. German engineers studying captured Fireflies admitted, albeit reluctantly, that they had underestimated both British ingenuity and industrial adaptability. They noted how the 17-pounder had been crammed into a turret barely large enough to contain it, how every inch of space had been repurposed with brutal efficiency. "It should not work," one report read, "and yet it does." In the field, the Firefly's effect was no longer confined to single ambushes. It had reshaped tactics entirely. Allied armored units began pairing Fireflies strategically, one per troop, guarding the others, the long-range killer among the pack. Infantrymen took comfort knowing that somewhere behind them, hidden under camouflage, a Firefly's barrel was trained on any threat that dared to appear. For the Germans, every tank duel became a gamble. The moment they saw a Sherman in the distance, they could never be sure if it was one of the countless 75mm versions or the one that could end them with a single hit. That uncertainty bred hesitation, and hesitation on the battlefield was fatal. In the Ardennes, as autumn deepened and fog rolled through the forests, German armor regrouped for one last great counterattack. They called it Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. It was meant to split the Allied front, to drive a wedge to the sea and reclaim the initiative. But among the Allied ranks preparing to defend, the Fireflies were waiting. Their crews knew that the thick forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes would favor ambush over maneuver, precision over speed. In one of the first clashes of that campaign, near the Belgian town of St. Vith, a Firefly from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment spotted movement through the morning mist. The gunner adjusted his optics, saw a shadow. A Tiger II, the most feared machine in the world. He exhaled, waited for the range to settle, and fired. The 17-pounder shell screamed across the clearing, striking the massive tank just below the turret ring. A blinding flash followed, then silence. The German counterattack continued, but something had changed. Their strongest armor could no longer guarantee their safety. Even the Tiger II, that monstrous fortress of steel, was not invincible. For the German officers, who had once laughed at the thought of a Sherman killing a tiger, the laughter was long gone. What remained was disbelief, and slowly, respect. The Firefly wasn't elegant, but it was relentless. It embodied the very principle the Germans had forgotten. A weapon didn't need perfection, only purpose. As the front lines froze in the bitter European winter, the Firefly became more than a machine. It became a lesson written in steel, that adaptability would always outlast arrogance, and that even the simplest design could, with the right idea, topple the strongest empire. Across the snowy forest, the echoes of its gunfire carried far. The Firefly had become the answer to the tiger. By the winter of 1944, the Firefly had become both a weapon and a symbol, the embodiment of Allied resilience and ingenuity. Where German tanks once rolled across Europe unchallenged, now they advanced with fear in their hearts, never knowing when that long British barrel would flash from a tree line or a ruined farmhouse. The Sherman Firefly was no longer just a modification. It was a declaration that the era of German dominance was over. In December, as the Battle of the Bulge raged, snow and mud blanketed the Ardennes. The conditions were brutal: freezing temperatures, poor visibility, fuel shortages. But where the heavy German armor bogged down, the lighter, more adaptable Shermans, including the Firefly variants, pressed on. Their engines coughed in the cold, their tracks slipped on the ice, yet they kept moving, and more importantly, kept fighting. In one engagement near Bastogne, a platoon of British Fireflies caught a German Panther formation attempting to flank the town. Visibility was low, the air thick with mist and snow. The Firefly commanders positioned their tanks on higher ground, using their superior range to turn the open valley below into a death trap. When the first Panther appeared, its crew confident in their frontal armor, the Firefly gunners waited. Distance was everything. The lead gunner adjusted his sight, 1,000 meters. He fired. The 17-pounder shell struck the Panther's turret front, piercing clean through. The explosion sent a column of flame into the air. Within minutes, the valley became a graveyard of shattered German armor. 3 Panthers destroyed, 2 more abandoned in panic. It was another reminder of how the balance of power had changed. German crews were now forced to fight cautiously, relying on ambush tactics and terrain rather than sheer strength. Their tanks, once symbols of terror, had become liabilities on open ground. The Firefly's reach extended far beyond its physical range. It had broken the psychological advantage that German armor once enjoyed. Back in Berlin, the reports read like an epitaph for German engineering arrogance. The Tigers and Panthers, masterpieces of design, were failing not because they weren't powerful enough, but because they were too complicated, too slow, too few. The Firefly, rough and improvised, had proven that reliability and simplicity were deadlier than perfection. For the crews who fought in them, the Fireflies became personal. They named their tanks Velvet Thunder, Black Prince, Nemesis. They painted kill markings on their barrels not out of pride, but as a way to mark survival in a war where the life expectancy of a tanker could be measured in weeks. Many crews never made it home, but their machines outlasted them, rolling across Europe like steel ghosts of defiance. By early 1945, the Germans were retreating on all fronts. Fireflies led armored columns across the Siegfried Line, their long guns pointing eastward toward the shattered remains of the Reich. The Allies no longer fought for parity, they fought for victory. And the Firefly, born from desperation in 1943, had become one of the war's great equalizers. In captured German documents found near Cologne, one chilling line stood out, written by a Panzer commander shortly before his death. The English Sherman with the long gun. It sees us before we see it. We cannot fight what we cannot reach. That sentence captured the transformation of the war. The Firefly wasn't just a weapon. It was the end of an illusion. The illusion that German engineering, no matter how refined, could not be matched. And so, as winter gave way to spring and the ruins of Europe emerged from beneath the snow, the Firefly rolled forward, battered, scratched, its paint scorched, its barrel scarred, but unbroken. It was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to win. The Tiger's reign of fear had ended the way all legends do, with a single thunderous shot from a weapon no one had taken seriously until it was too late. By the spring of 1945, the Firefly's long shadow stretched all the way into the heart of Germany. The tank that had begun as an improvisation, a desperate experiment to give the Allies a fighting chance, now rolled through shattered towns and villages as proof that necessity could triumph over perfection. The German generals who had once laughed at the Sherman's thin armor now stood amid the ruins of their own armored empire, watching columns of Fireflies advance across the Rhine. The roads were lined with the wreckage of what had once been the pride of the Panzerwaffe, Tigers, Panthers, Jagdpanthers, burnt-out hulks that testified to the shifting balance of war. Each wreck told the same story. Precision had failed where practicality endured. The German officers who examined them in retreat could no longer pretend. The age of domination through design had ended, and the Firefly had been one of its executioners. As Allied armor pushed deeper into Germany, the Firefly crews pressed on without pause. Their tanks bore scars from months of combat, chipped armor, cracked welds, scorched paint, but they kept running. In cities like Wesel, Hanover, and finally across the plains leading toward Berlin, the Firefly continued to do what it had done since Normandy. Stand between fear and victory. Its gunners no longer hesitated. They had seen what the 17-pounder could do. German tanks appeared less often now, their numbers too depleted to make a difference. Yet when they did, the Fireflies met them with the same deadly precision that had defined them from the beginning. One shot, one kill. For the men who drove and fought in them, the Firefly was more than a tank. It was redemption. They had spent years running from tigers and panthers, watching their comrades burn in machines that couldn't fight back. The Firefly gave them power. Not invincibility, but a weapon that demanded respect. The long barrel that once drew enemy fire was now a mark of pride, a symbol that the Allies could strike as hard as they could endure. German officers captured in the final months of the war spoke of their disbelief. "A Sherman destroyed us," one of them admitted in interrogation. "We built monsters, but you built a weapon that worked." That sentence became the unspoken verdict of the war. In the ruins of German industry, where once perfect machines lay silent, the simplicity of the Firefly stood as an answer to everything that had gone wrong for the Reich. The German engineers who examined its gun breech and turret design after the war called it inelegant but inspired. They could not deny what it represented, the genius of functionality over form. When the fighting finally stopped in May 1945, thousands of Fireflies stood scattered across Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the cobblestones of German cities. Some were still smoking. Others, silent and cold, bore the marks of every battle they had survived. They had become relics of victory, and somewhere among them, perhaps in a field turned green again by spring, one Firefly rested with its barrel still aimed east, its crew gone home, its mission complete. It had begun as a joke, a Sherman with a cannon too big for its turret, built out of desperation and doubt, but it ended as one of the most feared weapons of the war. The German officers who had once laughed now knew the truth. The Firefly had not only destroyed their tanks, it had destroyed their certainty. History would remember the Tiger for its power, the Panther for its precision, but the Firefly, the underdog that outlived them both, would be remembered for something far greater. It proved that innovation could be forged in necessity, that simplicity could outlast perfection, and that in the end, victory belonged not to the proud, but to those who refused to stop fighting. The laughter that once echoed across German command tables had long since faded into silence, replaced by the deep, echoing thunder of a 17-pounder gun. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.